you know what is abuse of right? An abuse of right occurs when an individual's right is exploited in a way that harms the community interest. Abuse of right in legal terms is defined as the exercise of a legal right only for the purpose of causing annoyance, harm, or injury to another person. Typically, humanity has breached a lot of rights, one of them being the right to equality. Right to equality ensures that everyone has equal rights regardless of religion, gender, or place of birth. It guarantees equitable employment chances in the government and protects against state discrimination in employment concern. The right to freedom comes next. Many rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom to pursue any profession are included in the concept of freedom of right. Next will be a right against exploitation. This right implies that human trafficking, begging, and other forms of forced labor are prohibited. It also suggests that children under the age of 14 are not allowed to work in risky settings. Aside from that, there is also the right to freedom of religion. All religions are treated with equal respect. There is no official religion in the state. Every individual has the freedom to freely exercise their religion. Other than that is cultural and educational rights. These rights protect religious and cultural rights by making it easier for them to maintain their legacy and tradition. Educational rights aim to ensure that everyone has access to a quality education regardless of their background. The right to constitutional remedies will be the last one. If citizens' fundamental rights are violated, the Constitution provides for remedy. No one's right can be violated open or restricted by the government. Do you know what is the definition of global economic crisis? To understand what global economic crises are, let us break the definition by each word. The first word is global. Global implies that the overall international and even universal connectivity. All nations on all continents on the earth are treated in the same context when the term global is used. Globalization, however, can be defined as the effect of the global economies opening up and the resulting increase in cross-national trade. Second word is economics. Economics is the study of how people allocate scarce resources for production, distribution, and consumption. It examines how individual, business, government, and nation make resource allocation decisions. The study of economics is typically divided into two categories, namely microeconomics and macroeconomics. In this paper, our focus is more on macroeconomics as a whole. Macroeconomics cover the overall economy on a domestic and international level, modeling it with highly aggregate economic data and elements. It can be focused on a certain geographical location, a country, a continent, or even the entire globe, which interrelated with the definition of global. The last word is crisis. A crisis occurs when something or someone is confronted with one or more extremely big issue. It can be referred to an uncertain period, especially one characterized by great difficulty or danger in politics, economics, or other fields due to a dramatic change or decline in the course of a problem. With that said, global economic crises are best defined as major economic difficulty caused by a sudden change or decline in the course of the problem over an indeterminate time period affecting the entire world.
Now that we have looked at what abuse of rights and global economic crisis are, we will try to interrelate the two. Question 3, which is the relevance of abuse of rights and global economic crisis, answers this question. What happens if a country launches an invasion on its neighbors, or if a country oppresses another country? Of course, the oppressed country would be affected in many ways. We will look at this in two instances. Firstly, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and secondly, from the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. First of all, we will look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is how it unfolded. On the 24th of February 2022, sirens were heard from all over Kiev. Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of his neighboring country Ukraine. He called the operation a special military operation in which he was trying to protect the borders of Russia from Western intervention. But in actual reality, it is a war against Ukraine. It is the first of its kind that Europe has ever seen since World War II. The war caused an unpredictable global economic crisis than the world had ever imagined. With both countries being net exporters of wheat, maize, and sunflower seed oil, The war has brought their trading with other countries to a halt. Ukraine's ports have been closed to exports as a result of Russian blockage of its ships passing, while Russia's exports have been banned by other countries. This has led to a disruption in the global food chain supply, which has further resulted in the overall price increase of food items around the world. Many countries are now faced with recessions as they have to cater for Ukrainian refugees who fled the war out of their own pockets. Now we will move to the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. The conflict dates back to the mid-20th century. The State of Israel was created on May 14, 1948. It had fought a war with Palestine in which about 750,000 Palestinians died. The war ended in 1949. However, in the present day, Israel divided territory that it had claimed from Palestine into three parts, which is the State of Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Israel claims that Palestine is creating terrorism, and for that reason, it launches attacks on Palestine through the help of the West, leading to the destruction of properties and the displacement of innocent Palestinian citizens. Israel also denies Palestine access to exporting or importing goods into the country through imposing border restrictions on the country. This has caused a food shortage in Palestine, which has left many, such as the vulnerable and children, malnourished.
When the misuse or abuse of rights have been exercised for their own interests, the rights of others will be violated and ignored, which will eventually lead to the worst crisis globally. Therefore, what is the impact of abuse of rights in recent history? The ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine has caused commodity prices around the world to soar amid concern and a sharp reaction to a possible fall in terms of supply. This is because both countries are major producers of sunflower oil, wheat, and corn, where Russia supplies more than 30% of the world's wheat supply. Due to the war, Russia continues to block Ukraine's key exports, preventing millions of tons of grain and other agricultural products from leaving the country, and consequently, if Ukraine's exports are not recovered to pre-war levels, several countries may experience long-term famines. According to the United Nations, as a result, worldwide supply has been curtailed, driving up the cost of alternatives, and the food prices around the world are about 30% higher than they were this time last year. When the two of the largest food producers are at war, millions of people from various countries suffer from the food crisis due to the inflation effect, when the price of commodities increases drastically because of the shortage of supply. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has worsened the food crisis in many African countries, according to Human Rights Watch today. Many countries in the East, West, Central, and South Africa rely on Russia and Ukraine for a significant proportion of their wheat, fertilizer, and vegetable oil imports, but the war disrupts global commodity markets and trade flows to Africa, areas that have already raised high food prices. Even countries that import very little from both countries are indirectly affected by rising global market prices for important raw materials or staple foods. Government and other parties need to ensure access to affordable food in Africa by strengthening economic and emergency assistance as well as social protection efforts. Otherwise, millions of people on the African continent could be hungry and starving. Meanwhile, the conflict between Palestine and Israel happened a long time ago until now, also due to the misuse or abuse of rights, where the innocent citizens become the victims of this cruelty. The exports from Gaza are almost completely banned, imports are so strictly restricted, and the flow of oil is stopped for several years. What is more worrying, this situation is causing many Palestinian children especially to suffer from malnutrition as a result of the food crisis they are facing. Among children aged 2 to 5 in Gaza experience acute malnutrition, where this problem includes anemia condition faced by 50.6% of Palestinian children, stunted growth problem of 15%, and 6.1% children are underweight. The Palestinians, especially in the Gaza Strip, have a low level of food securities. It starts with their difficulty getting food. The household census report revealed that 94.4% of the population have difficulty accessing supplies. Affected food supplies include livestock, meat, fruits, dairy products, flour, and bread. Thus, the ongoing Israel military siege limited the movement of people as well as food supplies. The United Nations Development Programme states that apart from the military siege, shortages of food commodities, rising food prices, and loss of sources of income also have a detrimental effect, especially on the poor in the Gaza Strip.
At the time of the study, a total of 92.1% of the population in Palestine was below the poverty line. As a result, Palestinians are forced to borrow, sell their properties such as coal, or rely on donations from monetary bodies to continue their survival.
Recently, the war between Russia and Ukraine has left these two countries in chaos, and the other countries were also affected due to this conflict. One of the economic crises that arise is the food crisis, which drags so many countries to be involved with. Export from Ukraine have stalled, future harvests are in doubt, global agriculture commodity prices have risen, and the countries that most exposed are those that rely on agricultural exports from Ukraine and Russia to feed their citizens to produce their own food. Ukraine and Russia account for at least half of all wheat imports in 26 countries. What can be done to prevent the worst consequences for both countries and the rest of the world? As an endeavor to fix this, analysts point out that there is enough wheat on global markets to supply global demand, and that markets will adjust to address export from shortage caused by Russia's conflict in Ukraine. Some low and middle income nations, such as India, may benefit from this shock, as wheat export hits an all-time high in March as growers fetched a greater price on global markets than the Indian government offered through its agriculture supports program. Next, experts from the International Food Policy Research Institute IFPRI recommend that countries continue to exempt food and fertilizer from sanctions as well as avoid hoarding and panic buying in order to keep supplies on global markets and keep prices from skyrocketing. To alleviate the impact of price increases on the poor, nations are suggested to direct food subsidies to the most vulnerable and give humanitarian aid through the World Food Programme. In the long run, try to avoid imposing market distorting subsidies and to think carefully about land conservation schemes. Other than that, the idea to avoid export ban and other trade restrictive measures, maintain open and transparent market and urge countries to do the same also can help the global food crisis problem. The Food and Agriculture of the United Nations FAO has proposed a global food import finance facility FIFF to reduce the cost of food import financing for low and middle income nations. Other experts have urged to grant debt relief for low and middle income countries, allowing them to use their reserve to cover higher food import costs. On the other hand, Palestinians who have been in food insecurity for many years still cannot freely join the economic sectors due to the Palestine-Israel conflict. The conflict has seized the Palestinian rights over their own property and country. Over the years, they have been victims of misuse and abuse of rights. For Palestinian, food security is a critical stage. While Palestinians were once self-sufficient, land seizures by the Israel government to make room for more settlers resulted in food shortage. The idea to overcome this problem has been voiced by so many non-government organizations (NGO). Palestinian farmers must have land to farm or be compensated for the farm they have lost. Israel restriction to water access must be removed, and all agricultural employees must be compensated in order to achieve Palestinian food security. Due to the lack of financing and assistance from the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian NGOs can stepping up to sponsor communal food initiatives and back farmers in their fight against land grabs. In order to make sure the food is enough to all the Palestinian Authority need to tie more deals with other countries like Egypt and Jordan to join the force to be the food supplier for Palestine and benefit both parties. One of the chances which gives new life to Palestinians is number of requests to speed up business link were granted by Egypt administration. Both parties resolved to do everything possible to deepen and accelerate commercial relations, including reducing travel restrictions for Palestinian businessmen and signing country of origin agreement, as well as opening the Egyptian market to Palestinian products, particularly in agriculture, while calling on Egypt to replace Israel in the importation of other items such as knowledge in field of oil and gas exploration and fish farming.
We already went through the definition of misuse or abuse of rights. What is global economic crisis? How does these two is interconnected, the impact, and how do we want to overcome this issue? But one last thing for us to ponder is how exactly this issue affecting us to achieve a better way to live, a green way, a sustainable way of living. All UN member states endorsed the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, providing a framework for the world to attain a sustainable way of life. As we already know the chronology of the Russia-Ukraine invasions and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I will just highlight few of the Sustainable Development Goals that have been sabotaged by these two events. The first SDG is SDG number 8. decent work and economic growth, where they emphasize the importance of creating long-term and sustainable economic growth, as well as full and productive employment and decent labor for everybody. Obviously, the wars happening in Russia, Ukraine, and also Palestine, Israel are not aligned with SDG 8. The war that block economic change, resulting in unemployment and short-term economic growth. The block of freedom for people to choose their path of work or force people to do jobs that are not in their interest could hinder productivity and together decrease economic growth. The second SDG is SDG number 12. Goals 12. Responsible consumption and production that rests on the use of the natural environment and resources in a way that continues to have less destructive impacts on the planet. The wars in Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean region definitely not align with SDG 12, as the environment and resources are not used in a way that have positive effects on the earth. The resources will be used to manufacture weapons for use in wars that would damage lands and result in the deaths and injuries of thousands of innocent people. Poverty reductions and the transition to low carbon and green economies can both benefit from sustainable consumption and production. However, it is difficult for countries that engage in wars to implement green economies because their major goal at the moment is to occupy the territory. As for the last SDG that we shall discuss in this video is SDG number 16. Peace, justice, and strong institutions, where the aims is to reduce all harms and promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for long-term development, ensuring universal access to justice, and establishing accountable institutions at all levels. The wars that happening are not even in the dictionary of peace and justice. People are forced to run from their lands, run from their homes, and had to take a hardship to only enjoy the minimal amount of justice. There is no government, there is no judicial system that could help them at war zone. Everything is collapsed: the government, the infrastructure, and the rights of the people. Obviously, the abuse of rights that resulting in the global economic crisis also has impact on other SDGs. We can actually explain how does this crisis sabotaging the sustainable development goals. However, we are at the limits of times, but let me ask this last question.
Walk the coffin out. The police fired stun grenades and pushed the crowd back. Many rushed for cover inside.
Complete chaos with people trying to get inside. I saw a woman with a very young baby, a patient or somebody who was here just at the hospital, caught